The morning sun cast long shadows across the Coronado Naval Base as Commander Jake Morrison made his way through the advanced marksmanship facility. At 42, Morrison carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of leading men through impossible situations. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless missions, and his gray eyes had seen things that would haunt lesser men for lifetimes. Today, however, those same eyes were focused on something entirely different: the annual inter-service precision shooting competition that would bring together the military's finest marksmen. Morrison had been tasked with selecting candidates for a classified operation that required shots at extreme distances. The mission parameters were unlike anything he had encountered before, calling for precision that pushed the boundaries of human capability. As he entered the armory, the familiar smell of gun oil and metal polish filled his nostrils, bringing back memories of countless hours spent preparing for missions that could turn on a single, perfectly placed shot. The facility buzzed with activity as dozens of elite shooters from various branches prepared their equipment. Marines adjusted their scopes with the methodical precision of surgeons. Army Rangers debated the merits of different ammunition loads. Air Force Special Operations personnel meticulously cleaned their rifles with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. But, in the far corner of the armory, away from the controlled chaos of preparation, sat a figure who seemed to exist in her own world entirely. Sarah Chen looked nothing like what most people expected when they heard the word sniper. At 5 feet 4 inches and barely 120 pounds, she could have easily been mistaken for a college student rather than one of the most lethal marksmen in military history. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her dark eyes held a depth that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the world around her. She wore standard military fatigues that appeared slightly too large for her frame, giving her an almost childlike appearance that belied the incredible skill contained within her compact form. Morrison watched from a distance as Sarah worked on her rifle with movements that seemed choreographed by years of practice. The Barrett M82A 1.50 caliber sniper rifle was a weapon that commanded respect from even the most experienced soldiers. Weighing over 30 pounds when fully loaded, it fired rounds that could penetrate engine blocks and disable vehicles at distances exceeding a mile. In the hands of an expert, it became a tool capable of changing the course of entire battles with a single squeeze of the trigger. But Sarah handled the massive weapon as if it were an extension of herself. Her fingers moved across its components with the familiarity of a pianist touching familiar keys. She disassembled and reassembled the bolt assembly with fluid motions that spoke of muscle memory developed through countless repetitions. When she adjusted the scope, her movements were measured and deliberate, each turn of the adjustment knobs calculated to achieve a precision that most shooters could only dream of achieving. What struck Morrison most was the silence that seemed to surround her. While other competitors engaged in animated discussions about wind conditions, ammunition preferences, and shooting techniques, Sarah worked in complete focus. She seemed to exist in a bubble of concentration that was both impressive and slightly unnerving. It was the kind of focus that Morrison had seen only in the most elite operators, men and women who had learned to shut out the world and achieve a state of near meditative awareness that allowed them to perform under the most extreme conditions. As Morrison approached, he noticed the small details that marked Sarah as someone truly exceptional. Her rifle case contained accessories and modifications that were not standard issue, indicating a level of personal investment that went far beyond what was required by military protocol. Custom ammunition boxes bore handwritten notes in precise handwriting, documenting load specifications and environmental conditions with scientific accuracy. A weather meter hung from her belt, along with a rangefinder and a small notebook filled with calculations and observations. But it was her hands that truly told the story. Despite her youth, Sarah's hands showed the calluses and small scars that came from thousands of hours spent handling firearms and crawling through rough terrain. Her fingertips bore the distinctive marks of someone who had spent countless hours adjusting screws and working with precision instruments. These were not the hands of someone who had learned to shoot in comfortable training facilities, they were the hands of someone who had earned their skills in places where mistakes carried deadly consequences. Morrison cleared his throat softly as he approached, not wanting to startle her while she worked with the weapon. Sarah looked up, and, for a brief moment, their eyes met. Morrison was struck by what he saw there, not the aggressive confidence he expected from elite shooters, but something deeper and more complex. There was wisdom in those eyes that seemed inconsistent with her age, along with a sadness that suggested she had seen things that had fundamentally changed her understanding of the world.
Mind if I ask what you're working on there?
Morrison said, his voice carrying the easy authority that came naturally to career military officers. Sarah set down the cleaning rod she had been using and looked at the commander with the respectful attention that military protocol demanded. "Just making sure everything is properly maintained, sir. The competition starts in an hour, and I want to be certain that my equipment won't let me down." Morrison nodded, appreciating the professionalism in her response.
"I'm Commander Morrison. I don't think we've been introduced."
"Specialist Chen, sir. Recently transferred from Army Special Operations." Sarah's voice carried a slight accent that suggested childhood spent somewhere other than the United States, though her English was perfect and precise.
"What brings you to our little gathering here, Specialist Chen?"
Sarah hesitated for a moment, and Morrison sensed that there was much more to her story than she was prepared to share with a stranger.
"I was recommended for the competition by my former commanding officer.
He thought it would be good for me to compete against shooters from other branches." Morrison suspected that recommendation had come with some very interesting paperwork attached. In his experience, soldiers didn't get transferred to inter-service competitions without having done something exceptional to earn the privilege. The fact that Sarah was here, handling a .50 caliber rifle like it was a familiar friend, suggested that her story contained chapters that would be fascinating to read. As if sensing his curiosity, Sarah returned her attention to the rifle, checking the scope mounts with the kind of attention to detail that Morrison associated with pre-mission preparations for critical operations. Her movements remained fluid and confident, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was not entirely comfortable being the center of attention. Morrison had learned long ago to read people quickly and accurately. Survival in special operations often depended on the ability to assess individuals rapidly and determine their capabilities, motivations, and potential value to a mission. As he watched Sarah work, his assessment crystallized around several key observations. First, she possessed technical skills that exceeded those of most shooters he had encountered. Second, her emotional control was remarkable for someone her age. Third, there was something in her background that had taught her lessons that most soldiers never had to learn. The competition would begin soon, and Morrison found himself genuinely curious about what Sarah Chen might be capable of achieving. The course of fire for today's event included targets at distances ranging from 800 meters to 1,200 meters, challenging enough to separate the truly skilled from the merely competent. Weather conditions were nearly ideal, with light winds and good visibility that would allow shooters to demonstrate their maximum capabilities. As other competitors began moving toward the firing line, Morrison noticed that Sarah took longer than most to complete her preparations. While others seemed eager to begin shooting, she continued to methodically check and recheck every aspect of her equipment. She verified that her scope was properly mounted, tested the smoothness of her bolt operation, and carefully examined each round of ammunition she planned to use. It was the kind of thoroughness that Morrison associated with operators who had learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. When Sarah finally stood and shouldered her rifle case, Morrison was struck again by the contrast between her appearance and the deadly efficiency with which she handled her equipment. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle seemed comically oversized when carried by someone of her stature, yet she moved with it as if it weighed no more than a standard hunting rifle. Her balance and coordination suggested someone who had spent significant time carrying heavy loads over difficult terrain, another indication that her military experience had included more than classroom instruction and training exercises. As they walked toward the shooting positions, Morrison found himself wondering about the story behind Sarah Chen's presence at this competition. In his experience, exceptional shooters usually came with exceptional stories, and something told him that Sarah's story might be more remarkable than most. The way she carried herself, the casual competence with which she handled her weapon, and the depth he had glimpsed in her eyes all suggested someone who had been tested in ways that left permanent marks on those who survived the experience. The firing line stretched across an elevated platform that provided shooters with clear lines of sight to targets positioned at various distances across the desert landscape. Each shooting position was equipped with a sturdy bench and adjustable rest, though Morrison knew that truly elite shooters often preferred to use their own support equipment when possible. The targets themselves were barely visible to the naked eye, appearing as small dots against the brown and tan backdrop of the Nevada desert. As Sarah claimed her assigned position and began setting up her equipment, Morrison noticed that several other competitors had begun to take notice of her presence. It was not uncommon for soldiers from different branches to size up their competition before formal events began, and Sarah's youth and gender made her stand out among the predominantly male field of competitors. Some of the looks she received were curious, others skeptical, but Morrison was pleased to see that most maintained the professional respect that was standard among elite military personnel. Sarah seemed completely oblivious to the attention she was attracting. She focused entirely on preparing her shooting position, adjusting the height and angle of her rifle rest with the same methodical precision she had displayed while cleaning her weapon. She checked the wind conditions using her handheld weather meter, made notes in her small notebook, and performed a series of dry firing exercises to verify that her trigger control remained consistent. Morrison positioned himself where he could observe the competition while keeping an eye on Sarah's performance. Something told him that he was about to witness something remarkable, though he could not have imagined just how remarkable it would prove to be. As the range officer began calling competitors to the line for the first stage of competition, Morrison found himself looking forward to seeing what Sarah Chen could accomplish when given the opportunity to demonstrate her skills under pressure. The desert air shimmered with heat as the first relay of shooters took their positions on the firing line. Commander Morrison watched from the observation area as 12 of the military's finest marksmen prepared for what many considered the most challenging precision shooting competition in the armed forces. The course of fire would test not only accuracy but also the ability to adapt to changing conditions, read environmental factors, and maintain consistent performance under pressure. Sarah Chen drew position 7, placing her roughly in the middle of the firing line between a Marine Corps Scout sniper with 15 years of combat experience and an Army Ranger who held the current record for the longest confirmed kill in Iraq. Both men had glanced at her with expressions that mixed curiosity with barely concealed skepticism. It was not unusual for young soldiers to be confident beyond their abilities, and Sarah's calm demeanor could easily be mistaken for the kind of overconfidence that often led to embarrassing failures in competitions like this one. But Morrison had spent enough time around truly elite operators to recognize the signs of genuine competence. Sarah's preparation had been methodical rather than hurried, thorough rather than obsessive. She had not engaged in the kind of nervous chatter that often preceded poor performance, nor had she displayed the aggressive bravado that sometimes masked insecurity. Instead, she had simply focused on ensuring that every variable within her control was optimized for success. The range officer, a weathered master sergeant whose voice carried the authority of 3 decades in uniform, called for the shooters to assume firing positions. The first stage would consist of 5 shots at targets positioned 800 meters downrange. Each target bore a 10-ring scoring zone roughly the size of a dinner plate, challenging enough to require genuine skill but achievable for competent marksmen shooting under ideal conditions. Sarah settled into her shooting position with movements that appeared almost casual in their ease. She adjusted her cheek weld against the rifle stock, verified her grip, and performed a series of breathing exercises that Morrison recognized as standard anxiety management techniques taught to special operations personnel. Her body position was textbook perfect, demonstrating the kind of consistency that could only be developed through countless hours of practice. The Marine to her left completed his sight adjustments and chambered his first round with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times before. The Army Ranger on her right muttered something under his breath about wind conditions, then settled into his own firing position with the confidence of someone who had proven himself in the most demanding circumstances possible. When the range officer called for shooters to commence firing, the distinctive crack of high-powered rifles echoed across the desert landscape. Morrison focused his binoculars on Sarah's target, curious to see how she would perform against such accomplished competition. What he saw in the first few seconds redefined his understanding of what was possible in precision shooting. Sarah's first shot impacted the target dead center, producing a hole that would have been difficult to improve upon even under laboratory conditions. Her follow-up shot, fired after what appeared to be minimal adjustment, landed so close to the first that the 2 holes nearly overlapped. By her third shot, it became clear that something extraordinary was happening at position 7. Morrison shifted his attention to the other targets to gain perspective on Sarah's performance. The Marines' shots formed a respectable group roughly 4 inches in diameter, well within the standards expected of elite military marksmen. The Army Rangers group was slightly larger but still demonstrated the kind of consistency that had earned him recognition as one of the service's finest shooters. Both men were shooting at a level that would have been considered exceptional in most circumstances. But Sarah's target told a completely different story. Her 5 shots had created what appeared to be a single ragged hole in the exact center of the 10 ring. Morrison had to adjust his binoculars to confirm that he was actually looking at 5 separate bullet impacts rather than some kind of optical illusion. The group measured less than 2 inches across, a level of precision that pushed the boundaries of what was mechanically possible with the equipment being used. The range officer called for a ceasefire and announced that spotters would now score the targets. Morrison watched as Sarah cleared her rifle and set it down with the same methodical care she had displayed throughout her preparation. Her expression remained neutral, showing neither satisfaction with her performance nor concern about the results. It was the kind of emotional control that Morrison associated with individuals who had learned to manage stress in life-or-death situations. When the scores were announced, a murmur of surprise rippled through the observation area. Sarah's 50 out of a possible 50 points represented perfect accuracy, but it was the quality of her shooting that truly impressed the experienced observers. While several other shooters had also achieved maximum scores, none had demonstrated the mechanical precision that characterized Sarah's target. The Marine next to her had scored 48 points with shooting that would have been considered excellent in any other context. He turned to Sarah with a look of genuine respect and offered a congratulations that carried none of the condescension that might have been expected given their difference in age and apparent experience. The second stage of competition increased the distance to 1,000 meters and introduced additional complications designed to test shooters' ability to adapt to changing conditions. Wind flags positioned at various points downrange indicated gusty conditions that would require careful reading and compensation. The targets themselves were smaller, with scoring rings that demanded even greater precision to achieve maximum points. Morrison noticed that Sarah spent considerably more time preparing for this stage than she had for the first. She consulted her weather meter repeatedly, made extensive notes in her logbook, and performed what appeared to be complex calculations using a small electronic device. Her preparation contrasted sharply with some of the other competitors, who seemed to rely more on intuition and experience than on scientific analysis of conditions. When the second relay commenced firing, the increased difficulty became immediately apparent. Wind gusts swept across the range at irregular intervals, creating conditions that challenged even the most experienced shooters to maintain consistent accuracy. Mirage rising from the heated desert floor further complicated the task of precise target engagement, requiring shooters to peer through atmospheric distortions that could make targets appear to dance and shift position. Sarah's approach to these challenging conditions revealed another dimension of her capabilities. Rather than rushing to engage the targets as quickly as possible, she waited for brief moments when wind conditions stabilized. Her shots were timed to take advantage of lulls in the gusty conditions, demonstrating a patience and tactical awareness that impressed even the most experienced observers. Her first shot at 1,000 meters struck the target with the same precision she had demonstrated at the shorter distance. The second shot, fired after she had waited nearly 30 seconds for favorable conditions, impacted within inches of the first. By her fourth shot, it became clear that Sarah was not merely shooting accurately, she was demonstrating a level of consistency that defied explanation. Morrison found himself focusing less on the scores and more on trying to understand how someone so young could have developed such extraordinary capabilities. The kind of shooting he was witnessing typically required years of intensive training combined with extensive field experience. Yet Sarah appeared to be no more than 25 years old, which meant that her military career could not have spanned more than a few years. The puzzle deepened when Morrison considered the equipment Sarah was using. While the Barrett .50 caliber rifle was undoubtedly capable of extreme accuracy, it was also one of the most challenging weapons to shoot consistently well. The massive cartridge produced significant recoil that could disrupt a shooter's position and affect follow-up shots. The rifle's weight and bulk made it difficult to handle, especially for smaller individuals who might struggle to manage its substantial mass effectively.
Yet Sarah handled the big rifle as if it were a precision instrument designed specifically for her use. Her shooting position remained rock-steady despite the weapon's recoil, and her follow-up shots came at intervals that suggested she was able to recover and re-establish her sight picture much more quickly than should have been possible for someone of her size and apparent experience. As the second stage concluded, Sarah had again achieved a perfect score while maintaining the mechanical precision that had characterized her performance throughout the competition. Several veteran shooters had begun to take notice of her results, and Morrison could see conversations beginning among the observers as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. The third and final stage would test shooters at 1,200 meters under conditions designed to simulate the kind of extreme challenges faced in actual combat operations. Targets would be exposed for limited time periods, requiring shooters to engage quickly while maintaining the precision necessary to achieve hits at such extended ranges. Additionally, shooters would be required to engage multiple targets in sequence, testing their ability to transition between different points of aim while maintaining consistent accuracy. Morrison noticed that Sarah's preparation for this final stage was even more intensive than what she had displayed previously. She spent several minutes studying the target array through a spotting scope, making detailed notes about the relative positions and apparent sizes of the various targets. She consulted meteorological data and performed calculations that appeared to account for the changing environmental conditions that were expected as the afternoon progressed. When the final stage began, the increased complexity of the challenge became immediately apparent. Targets appeared and disappeared according to a predetermined sequence that required shooters to transition rapidly between different ranges and engagement angles. The time constraints added pressure that had been absent from the earlier stages, testing not only accuracy but also the ability to perform under stress. Sarah's performance during this final stage revealed yet another dimension of her capabilities. Not only did she engage each target with the same precision she had demonstrated throughout the competition, but she did so while making transitions between targets that appeared almost effortless. Her rifle moved from one engagement position to the next with fluid motions that suggested hours of practice in rapid target acquisition and engagement. When the final scores were tabulated, Sarah had achieved something that Morrison had never seen before in 3 decades of military service. She had shot a perfect 150 out of 150 points while maintaining group sizes that approached the theoretical limits of mechanical accuracy. More importantly, she had done so under conditions that had challenged some of the most accomplished marksmen in the United States military. As the competitors began cleaning their equipment and preparing to depart, Morrison approached Sarah with questions that went far beyond casual curiosity. What he had witnessed during the past several hours suggested that she possessed capabilities that could be invaluable for the kind of specialized missions that his unit was being tasked to undertake. But, more than her shooting skills, it was her composure and professionalism under pressure that had impressed him most deeply. The mystery of Sarah Chen had only deepened during the course of the competition, and Morrison was determined to learn more about the remarkable young woman who had just redefined his understanding of what was possible in precision shooting. As he watched her methodically pack her equipment with the same attention to detail she had displayed throughout the day, he realized that their conversation was just beginning, and that the story behind her extraordinary performance was likely to be even more remarkable than what he had already witnessed. As the other competitors filed away from the shooting line, Commander Morrison found himself alone with Sarah Chen in the lengthening shadows of the Nevada afternoon. The temperature had begun to drop as the sun moved lower in the sky, but the heat radiating from the concrete shooting platform created an almost surreal atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the conversation that Morrison sensed was about to unfold. Sarah had continued her methodical equipment maintenance even after the competition concluded, treating her Barrett rifle with the kind of reverent care that Morrison associated with religious rituals. She disassembled and cleaned each component with movements that had become so automatic that she could perform them while carrying on a conversation, her hands working independently while her mind focused on other matters. "That was some impressive shooting today, Specialist Chen," Morrison began, settling into the conversation with the easy authority that came naturally to experienced commanders. "I've been around precision marksmen for most of my career, and I've never seen anything quite like what you demonstrated out there." Sarah looked up from her cleaning rod, meeting Morrison's eyes with a directness that many young soldiers found difficult to maintain when speaking with senior officers. "Thank you, sir. The conditions were favorable, and my equipment performed well."
Morrison recognized the deflection for what it was, a trained response designed to avoid drawing attention to exceptional performance. In his experience, soldiers who had seen real combat often developed a reluctance to discuss their capabilities openly, particularly when those capabilities had been tested under circumstances that carried life-or-death consequences. "I have a feeling there's more to the story than favorable conditions and good equipment," Morrison pressed gently.
"The kind of shooting I witnessed today doesn't happen by accident.
It takes years of dedicated training and, usually, significant field experience to develop that level of precision under pressure." Sarah paused in her cleaning routine, and Morrison could see her weighing how much information to reveal. The calculation was visible in her eyes as she considered the potential consequences of openness versus the risks of appearing evasive when questioned by a superior officer. "I've had some opportunities to develop my skills in challenging environments," she said finally, her voice carrying undertones that suggested those opportunities had been more demanding than she was prepared to discuss in detail. Morrison had conducted enough debriefings and interviews to recognize when someone was carefully managing the flow of information. Sarah's responses were truthful but incomplete, revealing enough to answer his questions while concealing details that she obviously considered sensitive or potentially problematic.
"What unit were you with before this assignment?" Morrison asked, shifting to questions that might yield more concrete information about Sarah's background and experience.
"I was assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment's sniper section," Sarah replied, and Morrison noted that she had chosen her words carefully. Rather than simply naming her unit, she had specifically identified her role within that unit, which suggested that her assignment had been somewhat specialized even within an elite organization.
Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at this information.
The 75th Ranger Regiment represented one of the most elite units in the Army, and their sniper sections were staffed exclusively by individuals who had demonstrated exceptional capabilities under the most demanding conditions. For Sarah to have been assigned to such a unit at her age suggested that she had distinguished herself early in her career through performance that exceeded normal expectations.
"How long were you with the Rangers?"
Morrison asked, beginning to piece together a timeline that might help explain the remarkable skills he had witnessed during the competition.
3 years, Sarah answered, and Morrison could see her reluctance to elaborate on the details of her service. "I completed 2 deployments to Afghanistan during that time."
Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. 2 combat deployments with Ranger sniper sections would have provided Sarah with the kind of intensive, real-world experience that could accelerate skill development far beyond what was possible through training alone. But, even accounting for such experience, her performance during the competition had exceeded what Morrison would have expected from someone with her apparent background.
"What made you decide to transfer away from the Rangers?"
Morrison asked, sensing that this question might touch on sensitive territory but needing to understand the circumstances that had brought Sarah to her current situation. Sarah's hesitation was longer this time, and Morrison could see her carefully considering her response. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested the decision had not been entirely voluntary. "There was an incident during my last deployment that resulted in some complications," she said carefully. "My commanding officer thought it would be beneficial for me to have a change of environment while those complications were being resolved." Morrison's experience with military bureaucracy translated Sarah's euphemistic language into a clearer picture. When promising young soldiers were transferred away from elite units following incidents that created complications, it usually meant that they had been involved in operations that had attracted unwanted attention from higher headquarters or outside agencies. Such transfers were often protective measures designed to shield valuable personnel while sensitive matters were investigated and resolved. "I see," Morrison said, allowing a moment of silence to indicate that he understood the subtext of Sarah's explanation without requiring her to elaborate on details that might be classified or personally sensitive. "Well, their loss appears to be our gain. I'm working on putting together a team for a specialized mission, and I could use someone with your particular skill set." Sarah's hands stopped moving for the first time since Morrison had begun their conversation. Her attention focused completely on the commander as she processed the implications of his statement. "What kind of mission, sir?" she asked, and Morrison could hear genuine interest in her voice for the first time since their conversation had begun. Morrison glanced around the now empty firing line, confirming that they were alone before continuing.
The kind that requires shots at distances that most people consider impossible, under conditions that would challenge the best operators we have. I can't provide details here, but I can tell you that it's the sort of assignment that could make a real difference in ongoing operations. Sarah's eyes showed a spark of interest that had been absent during her earlier responses. Morrison recognized the look of someone who had been feeling underutilized and was suddenly presented with the possibility of meaningful work that matched her capabilities. How long would the assignment last? Sarah asked, and Morrison could sense that she was beginning to evaluate the opportunity seriously. Indefinite, Morrison replied. The mission requirements are ongoing, and we need personnel who can handle extended deployments under challenging conditions. It's not the kind of assignment that works well with traditional rotation schedules. Sarah nodded slowly, and Morrison could see her weighing the implications of what he was proposing. An indefinite assignment with a special operations unit represented both an opportunity to utilize her skills fully and a commitment that would affect every aspect of her military career. There's something else you should know, Sarah said after a long pause, and Morrison could see that she had reached some kind of decision about how much of her story to reveal. The complications I mentioned from my last deployment, they're related to a shot I made in Afghanistan. It was at a distance that some people find difficult to believe. Morrison leaned forward slightly, sensing that Sarah was about to share information that would help explain the extraordinary capabilities he had witnessed during the competition. How difficult to believe, he asked, keeping his voice neutral to avoid putting pressure on Sarah to embellish her account. Sarah reached into her equipment case and withdrew a small notebook, turning to a page that contained detailed measurements and calculations written in the same precise handwriting Morrison had noticed earlier. 3,347 meters, she said quietly, watching Morrison's face for his reaction to the number. Morrison felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. A confirmed kill at 3,347 meters would represent one of the longest shots in military history, placing Sarah among a very small group of marksmen who had achieved what most considered the absolute limits of human and equipment capability. You're talking about more than 2 miles, Morrison said, his voice reflecting the awe he felt at the implications of such a shot. 2.08 miles, to be precise, Sarah confirmed. The target was an enemy sniper who had been engaging our forces from a position that conventional weapons couldn't reach. Weather conditions were nearly perfect, and I had excellent intelligence about the target's location and behavior patterns. Morrison realized that he was looking at someone whose capabilities far exceeded what he had initially estimated. A shot at such an extreme distance required not only extraordinary marksmanship skills but also advanced knowledge of ballistics, meteorology, and tactical planning. The fact that Sarah had successfully engaged a human target under combat conditions at that range placed her in a category occupied by perhaps a dozen individuals worldwide. What kind of complications did that create? Morrison asked, beginning to understand why Sarah's transfer from the Rangers might have been deemed necessary by her previous commanders. The usual bureaucratic nonsense, Sarah replied with the first hint of frustration Morrison had heard in her voice. Multiple investigations to verify the shot, questions about whether the engagement was necessary, concerns about media attention if the story became public. Some people apparently thought that having a 23-year-old woman make the longest confirmed sniper kill in military history might create public relations challenges. Morrison nodded, recognizing the political sensitivities that could surround such an achievement. The military's relationship with media coverage of special operations had become increasingly complicated in recent years, and exceptional individual achievements often attracted attention that commanders preferred to avoid. How was the shot verified? Morrison asked, curious about the process used to confirm such an extraordinary claim. Multiple independent witnesses, including my spotter and the forward observer team that called in the engagement, Sarah replied. We had GPS coordinates for both my position and the target location, plus video documentation of the target being neutralized. The investigation took 3 months and involved ballistics experts from Aberdeen proving ground. Morrison was impressed by the thoroughness of the verification process. Military protocol required extensive documentation for any claimed sniper engagement beyond certain distances, and the fact that Sarah's shot had been subjected to such intensive scrutiny and still been confirmed spoke to its authenticity. As the sun continued to set over the Nevada desert,
Morrison found himself looking at Sarah Chen with completely different eyes than he had just an hour earlier. The quiet young woman who had dominated the day's competition was not simply an exceptionally skilled marksman, she was someone who had achieved something that would be studied and discussed by military historians for decades to come. The mission Morrison was assembling would require exactly the kind of extreme-range capabilities that Sarah had proven she possessed. More importantly, it would require someone who could perform under the kind of pressure that came with knowing that mission success or failure might depend on a single, perfectly executed shot taken under impossible conditions. "I think you might be exactly what we're looking for," Morrison said as Sarah finished packing her equipment.
"Are you interested in hearing more about what we're working on?"
Sarah shouldered her rifle case and looked at Morrison with the same direct gaze that had impressed him throughout their conversation.
"Yes, sir," she said simply. "I'm very interested." 3 weeks after their initial encounter at the Nevada competition, Commander Morrison sat across from Sarah Chen in a nondescript briefing room at an undisclosed location outside Washington, D.C. The walls bore no identifying marks or insignia, and the windows had been covered with security film that prevented anyone from seeing inside or outside. The room's sterile environment reflected the classified nature of the conversation that was about to take place. Sarah had spent the intervening weeks undergoing a series of psychological evaluations, security clearance upgrades, and specialized training modules designed to prepare her for assignment to Morrison's unit. The process had been intensive and, occasionally invasive, probing into aspects of her background and personality that went far beyond standard military screening procedures. Morrison had used the same period to review Sarah's complete military record, including classified after-action reports from her deployments with the Rangers that painted a picture of exceptional performance under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The documentation surrounding her 3,347-meter shot filled an entire file folder, complete with ballistic calculations, meteorological data, and testimony from multiple witnesses that confirmed every detail of the extraordinary engagement. But it was not in the scorching heat of a military training facility in Nevada, where legends are born and records are shattered. A young woman sat quietly in the corner, methodically cleaning a weapon that most soldiers fear to touch. The Barrett M82A 1.50 caliber sniper rifle lay across her lap like a sleeping giant, its massive frame dwarfing her petite figure. She worked with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint, her fingers dancing across each component with an intimacy that spoke of countless hours spent in communion with this instrument of incredible power. Commander Jake Morrison had seen many things in his 20-year career with the Navy SEALs.
He had witnessed acts of extraordinary courage, impossible shots taken under pressure, and feats that defied human capability. But something about this scene stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just the sight of someone so young handling such a formidable weapon with such ease, it was the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she seemed to understand the rifle at a level that went beyond training or instruction. What Commander Morrison didn't know in that moment was that he was looking at Sarah Chen, a 23-year-old former Army sniper whose name was whispered in reverence among the world's elite marksmen. He didn't know that the rifle she was cleaning had been her companion during a shot that redefined what was humanly possible.
He didn't know that 3 months earlier, in the mountains of Afghanistan, this unassuming young woman had achieved something that military historians would debate for decades to come.
All he knew was that something extraordinary was happening in that quiet corner of the armory, and his instincts, honed by years of combat and command, told him that this was a story worth discovering.